The jungle of Okinawa was alive with sound. At dawn, the cicadas shrieked from the tangled canopy, their endless hum merging with the steady hiss of the Pacific wind moving through palm fronds and tall grasses. The air was heavy with mist and the cloying sweetness of decay, rotted leaves, wet earth, and the lingering scent of cordite from the battle the day before. A young American soldier, barely 20, tightened his grip on the smooth wooden stock of his M1 carbine. The weapon, lighter than the M1 Garand he had been issued in training, felt like an extension of his own body as he moved through the undergrowth. Sweat trickled down his neck, soaking the collar of his fatigues. His heartbeat quickened with every cautious step. The jungle offered concealment, but it also bred terror. Every rustle could be a snake. Every shadow could hide a Japanese rifleman waiting in silence. Ahead, his squad picked their way along a narrow trail cut by Marines days earlier. Mud clung to their boots. The trunks of banyan trees loomed like pillars of an ancient fortress, their roots twisting across the ground like veins. Somewhere in the thickets, machine gun barrels waited, fixed on killing zones. Then it happened. A crack tore through the dawn, followed by the sharp chatter of Japanese automatic fire. Muzzle flashes danced from the darkness. The squad dropped instantly, pressing against the earth, the smell of damp soil filling their nostrils. The young soldier shouldered his carbine and fired back, the sharp report of its .30 caliber rounds echoing through the thicket. Others joined him, their weapons spitting rapid fire, lighter and faster than the heavier rifles carried by the previous wave of Marines. The jungle flared with violence, and in that moment, the M1 carbine proved its worth. Compact, quick, and lethal in terrain where the bulkier Garand was a liability. This was Okinawa in the spring of 1945, a battlefield unlike any the Americans had faced before. It was the last great battle of the Pacific War, the bloodiest campaign of the island-hopping drive, and it would become the crucible that tested not only the endurance of men, but the tools they carried into combat. At its center was a rifle born of necessity, a weapon never meant to replace the Garand, but designed to give mobility and firepower to those otherwise left vulnerable, the M1 carbine. The story of this weapon was already years in the making. Its presence on Okinawa was not an accident of supply, but the result of deliberate innovation. In 1940, with Europe in flames and America teetering on the edge of war, the U.S. Army issued a call for a new firearm, something to arm clerks, drivers, engineers, mortar crews, and paratroopers who needed more than a pistol but less weight than a battle rifle. Winchester answered the call, designing a weapon that blended portability with speed. When it reached the Pacific, it found its true theater. Jungles where every pound of weight mattered, every second of response time decided survival, and every ounce of firepower tipped the balance between life and death. The carbine was not universally loved. Critics pointed out its short range, its lighter punch compared to the Garand's .30-06, and its occasional failures in thick mud. But on Okinawa, where combat was measured in yards rather than hundreds of meters, the carbine's advantages became undeniable. Its slim frame allowed soldiers to crawl through roots and rocks. Its semi-automatic action enabled rapid shots against fleeting targets, and its 30-round magazine in the upgraded M2 variant delivered bursts of firepower capable of cutting down bonsai charges before they reached American lines. The campaign that opened in April 1945 was a clash of desperation. For the Japanese, Okinawa was the gateway to the home islands. They fortified it with 100,000 defenders, burrowed deep into limestone caves and pillboxes, determined to bleed the Americans white. For the United States, it was the final stepping stone before the invasion of Japan itself, a battle where over 180,000 soldiers and Marines would hurl themselves against ridges, valleys, and labyrinths of tunnels. The carbine arrived here not as a footnote, but as a frontline equalizer. In the coming weeks, those lightweight rifles would echo across the Shuri line, over Kakazu Ridge, and through the tangled forests where every tree seemed to breathe hostility. Men who had once been cooks, drivers, or clerks found themselves transformed into riflemen, their carbines their only lifeline. As Japanese infiltrators crept into camps under cover of night, as defenders poured fire from hidden caves, the quick response of carbine-armed Americans often spelled the difference between holding ground and losing lives. It was in Okinawa's jungles that the carbine became more than an accessory. It became a soldier's companion. Each skirmish proved how a few pounds shaved from a rifle's weight could mean the survival of an exhausted Marine struggling uphill through mud. Each firefight showed how a weapon designed for support troops had become indispensable in the hands of frontline infantry. And each night of terror in the rain-soaked camps revealed that America's arsenal was not only vast, but adaptable, capable of delivering tools that shaped battles in unexpected ways. The dawn firefight faded as quickly as it had erupted. Smoke hung low over the trail, mingling with the mist. The young soldier's chest heaved as he reloaded, his hands trembling from the adrenaline still coursing through him. Around him, his comrades nodded grimly, alive for now. The carbine had spoken, and it had spoken with deadly authority. What lay ahead was months of brutal struggle, but with every shot fired in Okinawa's jungles, the legend of the M1 and M2 carbines grew. And so, to understand the edge they gave American soldiers, we must step back from the chaos of Okinawa and return to the beginning, to the factories and workshops of 1940 America, where the idea of a lightweight rifle was still just a proposal, and where the urgency of global war forged one of the most widely produced small arms of the 20th century. In the winter of 1940, before America had fired a single shot in the Second World War, a young ordnance officer stood on the frozen proving grounds at Aberdeen, Maryland. The air bit into his face as he watched a test shooter fumble with a standard-issue M1911 pistol. The shots echoed weakly into the empty field, most of them striking wide of the target. Beyond the officer, crates of M1 Garand rifles sat waiting, reliable, powerful, but heavy and long. The pistol was too weak for real combat, the rifle too burdensome for men burdened with radios, mortar tubes, or parachutes. The officer scribbled into his notebook, his breath visible in the cold. What the Army needed, he realized, was something in between. A weapon light enough to carry anywhere, yet fast and accurate enough to keep men alive when combat found them. This was the seed that would grow into the M1 carbine. The demand was born not from theory, but from the hard realities of a looming global war. In the late 1930s, as the Nazi blitzkrieg tore across Europe and Imperial Japan pushed deeper into China, American planners studied the reports with alarm. Mechanized warfare, mass infantry assaults, and airborne operations were changing the shape of battle. Officers and support troops could no longer rely on a sidearm for protection, nor could paratroopers jump safely into combat while weighed down with a 9.5-pound Garand. The U.S. Army's Ordnance Department put out the call in 1940 for a new kind of weapon, one that had never existed before in the American arsenal. The requirements were specific. The weapon had to weigh less than 5 pounds. It had to be shorter than a rifle, with enough accuracy to hit a target at 300 yards. It needed to be semi-automatic, simple to operate, and easy to maintain under the mud, dust, and grime of war. Most importantly, it had to be manufactured quickly and in massive numbers. If war came, there would be no time for luxury in design. The weapon had to be a tool of mass production, built not just in the hands of craftsmen, but on the assembly lines of American industry. Enter Winchester Repeating Arms Company, known for its lever-action rifles that had helped tame the American frontier. Winchester was already under pressure to shift its industrial might toward war. But when the carbine competition opened, the company saw its chance. Engineers led by Edwin Pugsley and David Marshall Williams, the latter a controversial figure who had once served time in prison for a fatal shooting, threw themselves into the challenge. Williams's short-stroke gas piston system, perfected behind bars while serving his sentence, became the key. It allowed a weapon to operate semi-automatically with minimal recoil and without the heavy machinery required by the Garand's system. Out of steel, walnut, and ingenuity, the Winchester team began to forge America's lightweight warrior. Cinematic moments played out on the testing grounds as prototypes were put through their paces. Soldiers fired from standing, kneeling, and prone positions, their shots snapping into paper silhouettes. The slim rifle responded quickly, light in the hands, easy to bring to the shoulder. Its .30 caliber cartridge, smaller than the Garand's powerful .30-06, was designed for controllability rather than brute force. The bullet flew true at short to medium ranges, delivering the accuracy and speed that officers and paratroopers would need. Watching from the sidelines, ordnance officials began to nod. This was not a pistol, and it was not a rifle. It was something entirely new. But proving a weapon on the firing line was only half the battle. The other half was proving it on the factory floor. America's strength was not only in its men, but in its machines. In 1941, as Lend-Lease shipments armed Britain and China, factories in the American Midwest and Northeast turned their gears toward war production. The M1 Carbine fit perfectly into this industrial storm. With fewer machining steps than the Garand, and with parts that could be subcontracted to dozens of companies, it was the weapon of mass mobilization. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked, Winchester and other contractors, General Motors' Inland Division foremost among them, were already preparing to churn out carbines by the millions. Inside the sprawling inland plant in Dayton, Ohio, workers lined assembly benches stretching hundreds of feet. Women in overalls and men deferred from the draft, riveted, polished, and tested each part. Sparks showered from welding torches, and the air rang with the sound of hammers and presses. From piles of raw steel and stacks of walnut blanks emerged sleek carbines, each one destined to be crated, shipped, and issued to a soldier who might depend on it with his life. It was the marriage of engineering ingenuity and America's unique ability to mobilize an industrial army. The first soldiers to handle the carbine were astonished by its weight, or lack of it. At just 5 pounds, it seemed almost insubstantial compared to the Garand. Infantrymen shouldered it experimentally, noting how quickly it came to aim, how little it kicked, how rapidly it fired. Paratroopers praised its compactness, some models even fitted with folding stocks for easier jumps. Officers who had previously carried pistols as symbols of rank discovered that they now had a weapon that gave them a fighting chance when leading from the front. In training camps across the United States, the crack of carbines began to join the thunder of Garands, the chatter of Thompsons, and the thump of mortars. Yet not all were convinced. Traditionalists in the Army worried that the lighter cartridge lacked stopping power, that the carbine was neither fish nor fowl, too weak for rifle duty, too large for sidearm duty. Critics questioned whether it could truly serve in the unforgiving crucible of combat. But the Army was out of time. The storm of war was already on America's doorstep, and the carbine was the answer the nation had built. By the time U.S. forces stormed Guadalcanal and North Africa in 1942, carbines were already in their hands. It was here that the weapon would face its first tests in fire and blood. And as American soldiers soon discovered, the lightweight rifle designed for cooks, clerks, and paratroopers was about to become a frontline companion in some of the most savage battles of the Second World War. In the training fields of 1944, a young Marine crouched behind a sandbag wall, his heart pounding as he pulled the trigger of a weapon that felt both familiar and entirely new. The carbine in his hands looked much like the ones his comrades carried, but when he switched a small selector lever, the rifle roared to life. In a controlled burst, the barrel bucked lightly against his shoulder as a stream of .30 caliber rounds tore through the air, chewing up the wooden target in a splintering spray. The Marine grinned despite himself. Here, at last, was the promise of automatic firepower in a package light enough to carry through jungles, ridges, and towns. The M1 carbine had given birth to its faster, deadlier offspring, the M2. The story of this transformation began with the battlefield itself. By 1943, American forces had been fighting across multiple theaters, from the frozen mountains of Italy to the steaming jungles of the Pacific. In each environment, the enemy was learning to adapt. German units used ambushes in hedgerows and urban blocks, while Japanese troops launched desperate banzai charges through tangled jungle and darkness. The carbine, lightweight and versatile, had already proven itself. But commanders recognized a new challenge. Troops needed not just rapid single fire, but the ability to unleash suppressive bursts in close combat. It was no longer enough to rely on the Thompson submachine gun alone, which was heavier, expensive, and far less available. The Army's Ordnance Department began looking for a way to evolve the carbine into something more. Mechanically, the change seemed simple, yet it represented a major leap. Winchester's engineers devised a selective fire mechanism, adding a switch that allowed the riflemen to toggle between semi-automatic and fully automatic fire. The receiver was strengthened, the sear redesigned, and a new 30-round magazine introduced to feed the faster appetite of the weapon. What emerged was the M2 carbine, outwardly similar to its predecessor, but transformed in spirit. Now, a soldier could fire rapidly at individual targets or deliver a blistering burst of fire to cut down an advancing squad. This innovation came at a cost. Automatic fire generated heat and strain, and the lightweight carbine was never built for the sustained barrages that heavier weapons could deliver. Accuracy, too, diminished as the muzzle climbed under recoil, forcing soldiers to learn short bursts rather than long streams. The .30 carbine cartridge, while controllable, lacked the raw power of the Garand's .30-06, meaning that beyond close range, the M2 could not dominate. Yet within the ranges where most infantry firefights actually occurred, less than 150 yards, it became a devastating tool. Soldiers and Marines began experimenting with the new model in training camps. Vivid accounts describe squads drilling with the M2, learning to integrate its fire into their tactics. A two-man team, one with a Garand for long-range accuracy and another with the M2 for close-range bursts, could suddenly dominate both ends of the fight. In jungle terrain, where visibility was often measured in feet rather than yards, the M2 offered a way to stop ambushes cold. Troops learned to keep their carbines loaded with the new 30-round magazines, practicing quick reloads under pressure. Instructors hammered home the need to conserve ammunition. Automatic fire was a temptation, but every wasted round might cost a life when supplies ran thin. Behind the training grounds lay the vast machinery of logistics. Supplying the carbine with its unique ammunition posed challenges, as the .30 carbine round was not interchangeable with either the Garand's cartridges or the submachine gun's .45 caliber rounds. Boxes of carbine ammunition, each holding 600 rounds, had to be shipped, sorted, and delivered across oceans to units scattered from France to the Philippines. Yet America's industrial system rose to the challenge. By 1945, billions of .30 carbine rounds had rolled off assembly lines, destined to feed both the M1 and its automatic sibling. It was a staggering demonstration of how American industry could adapt in step with battlefield needs. As the M2 reached frontline units, reports filtered back of its impact. In Italy, troops clearing towns used the weapon to storm buildings, its bursts clearing stairwells in seconds. In the Pacific, Marines defending night perimeters discovered its value when Japanese infiltrators tried to slip into camps under cover of darkness. The rattle of M2 fire ripped through the night, breaking assaults before they could gather momentum. Soldiers spoke of the confidence the weapon gave them, confidence that in the chaos of close combat, they could respond with overwhelming firepower. But alongside praise came caution. Veterans warned newcomers not to depend on the M2 at long range, reminding them that discipline was key. Ammunition burned quickly under full auto, and careless bursts could leave a man with an empty magazine at the worst moment. Officers drilled their men on balance, using semi-automatic fire for precision, then switching to bursts when the enemy closed. The carbine's evolution was not just mechanical, but tactical. It demanded a new way of thinking, one that valued adaptability over rigidity. The transition from the M1 to the M2 symbolized a broader truth about America's war effort. Weapons were not static tools. They were evolving instruments shaped by the battlefield and refined by the urgency of survival. Just as tanks had grown heavier, aircraft faster, and ships more lethal, the carbine itself had adapted to meet the unpredictable nature of modern combat. It was proof that American industry and ingenuity could not only equip soldiers, but transform their tactics mid-war. By 1945, tens of thousands of M2 carbines were in circulation, though never in the same overwhelming numbers as the M1. For many who carried it, the weapon represented a lifeline, a way to bridge the gap between rifle and submachine gun, between mobility and firepower. To those soldiers, the selector switch was not just a piece of metal. It was the difference between life and death in the split seconds when combat narrowed to its most desperate moments. The M2's story did not end with victory in 1945. It would resurface in Korea, where its full auto capability became both a blessing and a curse against waves of Chinese assaults. But its roots lay in that wartime transformation, when America, staring into the chaos of global conflict, recognized that adaptability was survival. The carbine had begun as a lightweight rifle for support troops. By evolving into the M2, it had become a frontline weapon, reshaping how squads fought and proving that in war, nothing stays still for long. Rain hammered against steel helmets as American troops clawed their way up a ridge on Okinawa. The ground beneath them was slick mud, churned by days of artillery fire and tropical storms, clinging to boots and dragging men backward with every step. Somewhere in the jungle ahead, the staccato burst of a Japanese Nambu machine gun tore through the downpour, bullets whipping past and smacking into the sodden earth. A corporal dropped to his knees, raised his M2 carbine, and let loose a controlled burst. The muzzle flashed bright in the gray dawn, the weapon rattling in his hands. 30 rounds spat out in a matter of seconds, slashing into the brush where the muzzle flashes had come from. The gunfire stilled. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of rain and the groans of exhausted men forcing themselves upward. The carbine had done its job once again, cutting through the chaos of one of the most brutal battles of the Pacific War. The Battle of Okinawa was the ultimate test of America's arsenal. Beginning on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day, the invasion force of more than 180,000 Marines and soldiers stormed the island's beaches in what was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific. Awaiting them were some 100,000 Japanese defenders under General Mitsuru Ushijima, entrenched in a vast network of caves, tunnels, and ridges. The island was transformed into a fortress, designed not to repel the landing outright, but to bleed the Americans in a grinding war of attrition. For the men sent to take it, every ridgeline was a killing field, every ravine a trap, every cave mouth a doorway to sudden death. In these conditions, the carbine revealed both its virtues and its flaws. Troops burdened with mud-caked packs and waterlogged uniforms found comfort in the weapon's light weight. At barely 5 pounds unloaded, it could be carried easily through the sucking terrain, a critical advantage when Garands weighed nearly double. Infantry squads moving uphill under fire found that the carbine allowed them to keep their speed. In the close confines of Okinawa's tangled undergrowth and narrow cave approaches, the weapon's compact frame gave soldiers freedom to maneuver that larger rifles simply could not match. Cinematic vignettes from the campaign capture the carbine's role with startling clarity. On Kakazu Ridge, where Japanese defenders unleashed withering crossfire from hidden pillboxes, Squads of Marines crawled forward with carbines held tight against their chests. Bursts from M2s rattled into the embrasures, forcing defenders to duck and giving flamethrower teams precious seconds to advance. At Sugarloaf Hill, where the 6th Marine Division fought a nightmarish series of assaults and counter-assaults over a single blood-soaked mound, the sharp crack of M1 carbines echoed alongside the rattle of Thompsons and the thunder of mortars. Marines armed with 30-round magazines blasted into charging enemy troops, cutting down waves before they could overwhelm the line. Japanese tactics on Okinawa demanded such firepower. Unlike earlier battles where banzai charges often came in daylight, defenders here adapted to American firepower by striking at night or from concealment. Soldiers slipped through the lines under cover of darkness, emerging suddenly within American camps. In those desperate moments, the carbine proved indispensable. A sentry, startled awake by movement in the shadows, could bring his carbine up quickly, firing rapid shots into the darkness. The weapon's manageable recoil and fast action meant a soldier could respond faster than if armed with the heavier Garand or a cumbersome BAR. In countless night engagements, it was the carbine that broke infiltration attempts and saved sleeping units from being butchered. The M2's fully automatic capability, still new to the battlefield, was devastating in Okinawa's jungle skirmishes. In ambushes, when Japanese troops burst from camouflaged caves or trenches, a Marine could flip the selector switch and unleash a storm of rounds in seconds. The 30-round magazines, while prone to jams if poorly maintained, gave him the sustained firepower to stop an attack in its tracks. Veterans recalled the psychological effect of that firepower, how the rattle of an M2 carbine, lighter and higher pitched than a Garand, seemed to fill the air, drowning out the screams of attackers and the chaos of close combat. Yet the carbine was not without its limitations. Against the thick walls of Okinawan caves, its smaller .30 caliber round often lacked the penetrating force of the Garand's heavy bullet. Troops learned quickly that the carbine was best in close combat and clearing operations, not in blasting entrenched positions. When confronted with caves or reinforced pillboxes, they relied on explosives, flamethrowers, and artillery. Still, once the flame and blast had driven the enemy into the open, the carbine was there to finish the fight. The human cost of Okinawa dwarfed all earlier campaigns. American forces suffered more than 12,000 killed and 36,000 wounded. Japanese losses reached staggering levels. Over 100,000 defenders perished, many choosing death over surrender. In that furnace of destruction, the carbine became etched into the memories of those who carried it. Soldiers recalled the mud-caked walnut stalk pressed against their shoulder, the sting of spent casings on their skin, and the strange relief of feeling a weapon light enough to carry through endless days of fatigue. One Army rifleman later described crawling through a rain-slicked ravine with his M1 carbine hugged to his chest, its barrel taped against mud. As enemy grenades tumbled down from above, he returned fire in quick bursts, the weapon spitting defiantly through the smoke. When the firefight ended, he realized he had survived only because the carbine allowed him to stay mobile, to keep firing even when weighed down by exhaustion. His story echoed thousands of others, ordinary men whose survival hinged on the design of the tool in their hands. By the time the battle ended in June 1945, Okinawa was a graveyard. Entire divisions had been gutted, villages reduced to rubble, and the civilian population devastated. Yet within this carnage, the carbine had passed its most brutal trial. It had shown that a weapon designed for clerks, drivers, and paratroopers could become indispensable to frontline infantry. Its adaptability had kept pace with the evolving war, proving itself in the crucible of America's costliest Pacific battle. The carbine's legacy on Okinawa was more than statistics of rounds fired or positions captured. It was written in the exhausted faces of Marines stumbling back from Sugarloaf Hill, in the mud-soaked uniforms of Army riflemen collapsing after days of continuous fighting, and in the silence of ridges littered with broken weapons and lifeless bodies. The M1 and M2 carbines were there through it all. Light, fast, imperfect, but vital. And as the guns finally fell silent on Okinawa, with the island secured and the next step toward Japan looming, the question became clear. If the carbine had proven itself here, how would it shape the battles yet to come? The answer would be found not only in the ruins of Okinawa, but in the desperate final measures of the Japanese defenders, who were already preparing to resist America's advance with tactics as deadly as they were desperate. ChatGPT said, "Night descended on Okinawa with a suffocating weight. The jungle, steaming from the day's relentless rain, swallowed sound and light until every movement seemed amplified. In the darkness, American soldiers huddled behind sandbag walls and foxholes, their carbines gripped tightly, fingers brushing the cold steel of the trigger guards. Out there, in the blackness, they knew the enemy was waiting. Suddenly, a shrill cry cut through the stillness, followed by a thunderous roar of feet pounding against the mud. A wave of Japanese soldiers surged forward, bayonets fixed, grenades clutched, faces illuminated by the flares streaking across the sky. It was a desperate banzai charge, a tactic born of courage and futility. The Americans opened fire, their carbines snapping in rapid succession. 30-round magazines spat streams of bullets, cutting into the human tide before it reached the perimeter. In seconds, the attack faltered. Bodies sprawled in the mud. The jungle fell silent once again, broken only by the uneven breathing of men who had lived through another night. For the Japanese defenders, the Battle of Okinawa was the culmination of a strategy rooted in sacrifice. General Mitsuru Ushijima and his commanders knew that America's industrial might had produced more planes, more tanks, and more guns than Japan could ever hope to match. Their only chance was to bleed the Americans so heavily that an invasion of the home islands would seem impossible. In practice, this meant turning every cave, every ridge, and every foot of ground into a weapon. Suicide charges, infiltration raids, and fortified cave networks became the tools of resistance. The carbine, however, complicated their plans. Designed for speed and maneuverability, it allowed American troops to meet sudden assaults with overwhelming firepower. Japanese diaries and after-action reports reveal the grim reality of fighting against it. Soldiers described the small American rifle that fires too quickly, a weapon that cut down infiltrators before they could close to bayonet range. In earlier campaigns, Japanese forces had exploited the slower rate of fire of bolt-action rifles, closing the distance before defenders could cycle their weapons. On Okinawa, the carbine denied them that advantage. Infiltration squads creeping into American lines found themselves discovered and annihilated by rapid bursts before they could strike. Even when suicide attackers hurled themselves forward, the carbine's light recoil and quick handling allowed defenders to keep shooting, each trigger squeeze bringing another attacker down. The desperation of the defenders drove them to innovate in ways as haunting as they were futile. Engineers carved labyrinthine tunnels through Okinawa's limestone ridges, creating networks where men could vanish into the earth and reappear behind American lines. Hidden cave mouths opened suddenly with bursts of fire, and entire platoons disappeared into the underground defenses. In theory, these tunnels should have given Japanese forces the ability to offset American firepower. In practice, once U.S. troops closed the distance, carbines and flamethrowers cleared the entrances with deadly speed. Veterans recalled firing into dark cave mouths with their carbines, muzzle flashes lighting the cavern for a split second, followed by the echo of screams and silence. In some cases, the Japanese tried to neutralize the carbine by attacking at night, believing that confusion would blunt its effectiveness. Small units infiltrated American positions, crawling low, cutting through barbed wire, and slitting throats before alarms could be raised. But once the first shot rang out, the carbine turned the tide. Its compact design allowed sentries to fire instinctively, unleashing rapid, aimed shots without fumbling in the darkness. Japanese survivors wrote bitterly of these encounters. calling the carbine a weapon that robbed them of their courage by denying them the close-quarters combat they craved. Still, their determination never faltered. Japanese soldiers fought with a ferocity that defied reason, often carrying out suicide charges with little more than grenades tied to their waists. These attacks were horrifying spectacles. Men screamed the emperor's name as they hurled themselves against American positions, knowing they would die. Yet against the carbine, such sacrifice was consumed by firepower. Squads of Americans, armed with automatic M2 variants, shredded these human waves in seconds. Survivors of these assaults later described the field as a nightmare landscape, where courage met the cold mechanics of industrial war. The emotional contrast of Okinawa is difficult to overstate. On one side were Japanese soldiers and civilians prepared to die in service of a hopeless cause, their letters filled with stoic resignation and pleas for their families to endure. On the other side stood American troops, exhausted and horrified, yet equipped with a weapon that gave them a decisive edge. The carbine did not make the war less brutal, but it shifted the balance in countless firefights. Without it, many small unit actions might have ended in disaster. With it, squads survived night after night, battle after battle, even as the larger campaign consumed tens of thousands of lives. The desperation of the defenders mirrored the collapse of Japan's wider war effort. By spring 1945, the empire's cities burned under American bombers. Its navy lay broken on the ocean floor, and its supply lines had been strangled. Okinawa was a last stand, and its soldiers fought with the knowledge that there would be no reinforcements, no retreat. That desperation gave their attacks a terrifying intensity, but also a tragic futility. Industrialized firepower, the tanks, planes, artillery, and yes, the humble carbine, ensured that no amount of sacrifice could stem the tide. By June, the battle was drawing to a close. The once proud Japanese 32nd Army had been shattered, its soldiers reduced to scattered groups still hiding in caves, making desperate last stands. For the Americans, the cost had been staggering, but the carbine remained a quiet constant. Survivors remembered it as the weapon that saved their lives when chaos erupted suddenly in the night. For the Japanese, it was an emblem of a wider truth, that courage and sacrifice alone could not overcome the relentless power of an enemy whose factories and arsenals never ceased to produce. The section of Okinawa's story devoted to Japanese countermeasures ends not in triumph, but in tragedy. Their tactics, born of desperation and bravery, collided head-on with a weapon designed for adaptability and rapid response. It was a clash between human resolve and industrial technology, fought in jungles and caves where life was measured in seconds. And as Okinawa burned, it became clear that the carbine was not just another tool of war. It was part of a larger machine that ground down even the most determined resistance. The survivors of those nights carried the memories with them forever. For Americans, it was the sound of the carbine's sharp report cutting through fear. For the Japanese, it was the knowledge that no matter how fast they charged, no matter how deep they dug, the enemy's firepower was waiting. That contrast, the human will to resist against the cold efficiency of mechanized war, defined the struggle on Okinawa, and it foreshadowed the even darker choices that lay ahead, as Japan's leaders weighed how far they were willing to go to resist defeat. The jungle of Okinawa fell quiet in the days after the guns ceased firing. Rain still poured across the scarred ridges, and smoke still curled from shattered villages. But for the survivors, silence felt heavier than battle. A Marine sat on a battered ammunition crate, his M1 carbine across his knees. The walnut stock was scratched and worn smooth by weeks of mud and sweat. For him, it was more than a weapon. It was the companion that had carried him through chaos, the tool that had answered the darkness with fire. That image, repeated across the island, marked the beginning of the carbine's legacy, a story that would stretch far beyond Okinawa and into the conflicts of a new age. As the Pacific War neared its conclusion, the carbine remained in the hands of tens of thousands of American soldiers and Marines. On Okinawa, it had proven its worth in jungles, caves, and close-quarters night battles. Now it would accompany troops as they prepared for the invasion of Japan, an operation that never came but for which every soldier drilled. Instead, the war ended with the shock of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leaving those who had carried the carbine to bring it home as a reminder of their survival. To them, it was not simply an issued rifle, but a symbol of adaptability, of the way American industry had matched soldiers' needs with astonishing speed. But the story of the carbine did not end in 1945. It became one of the most widely distributed American small arms of the 20th century. In Korea, as winter gripped the mountains and Chinese forces poured across the Yalu River, the M2's full auto capability became both a lifeline and a liability. Soldiers praised its light weight in the steep terrain, but cursed the way the .30 carbine round lost power in freezing conditions, sometimes failing to penetrate heavy winter clothing at long range. Veterans of the Chosin Reservoir remembered firing desperately into human waves, their M2s rattling in bursts that cut attackers down at close range. Yet they also spoke of jams, of thin magazines that bent under pressure, and of the way the weapon demanded constant attention. The carbine remained a soldier's ally, but one that had to be handled with care. In Vietnam, the carbine found a second life. Advisors in the early 1960s carried them into the jungles, where its compact size made it ideal for helicopter operations and jungle patrols. South Vietnamese forces were issued vast numbers of M1 and M2 carbines under American aid programs, and for many young soldiers, it was their first firearm. The carbine's lightweight frame once again proved valuable in the thick undergrowth, but the same criticisms followed it: insufficient stopping power at range, and a tendency to jam in muddy conditions. Still, for thousands of soldiers and militia fighters, it was the weapon that defined their war. In photographs from the Mekong Delta, villagers turned soldiers clutch carbines across their chests, proof of its enduring reach across decades and continents. For American veterans, the carbine's legacy was deeply personal. Letters, interviews, and memoirs recall how it changed the way men fought and survived. One Marine remembered how the carbine let him carry more ammunition than he ever could with a Garand, a detail that meant life or death in a night engagement on Okinawa. An Army rifleman later wrote that he had doubted the weapon until the first time he faced a Japanese charge. The speed with which he could fire convinced him it was worth every ounce of steel and wood. Another soldier admitted that while he distrusted its power at distance, he loved it for the way it saved his back, light enough to sling over his shoulder during endless marches. The carbine's memory, for these men, was bound not in statistics or ballistics, but in moments of survival and camaraderie. From a historical perspective, the carbine embodied the union of technology and industry. It had been designed in 1940 for support troops, mass-produced by American factories, and thrust into frontline service by necessity. Its existence was proof that the United States could not only mobilize millions of men, but also create the tools to arm them effectively. More than 6 million carbines were produced during the war, a staggering figure that reflected the scale of American industrial capacity. No matter how determined the enemy, the ability to equip every soldier with a weapon tailored to his role was an advantage Japan could never match. And yet, its legacy is not one of triumph alone. The carbine is tied to memories of horrific sacrifice, of jungles filled with bodies, of ridges stained with blood, of soldiers who carried it but never came home. To speak of the carbine's success is to remember that it was purchased at staggering cost. More than 12,000 Americans died on Okinawa, and over 100,000 Japanese soldiers perished, along with tens of thousands of civilians caught in the crossfire. The carbine played its role in securing victory, but it could not ease the burden of grief carried by those who survived. Today, the M1 and M2 carbines rest in museums, in veterans' collections, and in the memories of those who bore them. They remain icons of mid-century warfare, instantly recognizable for their slim stocks and distinctive silhouette. Historians debate their effectiveness, but for the men who clutched them in the mud, rain, and fire of battle, the carbine was far more than a weapon. It was the partner that gave them a fighting chance, the bridge between survival and oblivion in the deadliest battles of the Pacific. As the war ended, and the world shifted into uneasy peace, the carbine stood as a reminder of a truth that defined the 20th century. That technology, when paired with the mass production of an industrial society, could alter the fate of nations. On Okinawa, in Korea, and in Vietnam, the carbine showed how a single idea, lightweight firepower for the common soldier, could ripple across generations of war. Its story is one of adaptation, resilience, and the relentless drive to match human courage with the tools required to endure. And so the memory lingers, a young soldier in a rain-soaked trench, gripping his carbine as shadows moved in the dark. He did not think of factories or engineering breakthroughs. He thought only of survival and of the weapon in his hands. In that moment, the carbine was more than wood and steel. It was hope. It was endurance. It was the jungle rifle that carried him through the storm, etched forever in the memory of those who bore it, and in the history of a war that reshaped the world.